I was asked to talk about Versailles since this year's focus of the festival is on French music. So I really hope that this brief art historical romp will provide a backdrop for the music you've been listening to and that you will be hearing for the remainder of this wonderful festival. I will mostly talk about the 17th century, focusing on the creation of the palace. Of course, there was important construction in the following century, but given the limited time we have, I thought it would make sense to focus on the palace and its grounds as they were conceived during the reign of Louis XIV. So, let me introduce you to Louis. Santrigo's portrait of the king is the ultimate example of a grand portrait, presenting the monarch as a larger-than-life figure. The canvas, as you can see, I put the dimensions, is over 9 feet high. Depicted full length, the king is slightly elevated on a platform and looks down to the viewer. He's indeed on a stage of sorts, as he stands with his feet in 4th position, his body facing to the side, but turning his head towards us. Dressed in his ermine-lined coronation robes, he's surrounded by the regalia, the symbols of his kingship. He extends his arm, his right arm, and rests his hand on a scepter, with the royal crown next to it. Louis holds his left arm akimbo, causing his elbow to jut, as it were, into the viewer's world. His figure spreads in space, literally radiating, and you can really see in the composition how the feet form a diagonal, so it creates this kind of line. We have another diagonal in the opposite direction with the upper body and the axis of the shoulders. The stool and pillow to his right and the throne behind him are covered in the same fabric as his mantle, and thus prolong his body. That blue fabric, which occupies a sizable portion of the composition and spreads from one side of the canvas to the other, holds the heraldic symbols of the French monarchy, the gold fleur-de-lis on a blue background. Note how the red curtain above Louis, a fixture of grand portraits, frames his body, but leaves enough space around him as to give an impression of ease, of space, of luxury. Keep in mind that in 1701, when Rigaud painted this portrait, Louis was 63 years old, and yet he does not appear as an old man. A few additional notes: you can definitely see his legs. He was very proud of his legs. He learned to dance very early on and was a very good dancer. So, dance keeps your leg in good shape. And he was a really good-looking man, but he was a little worried that he was not tall enough. So he started the fashion of wearing high heels, which you can definitely see here. Versailles is more than an abode for the King of France. First and foremost, it fulfills a very specific function. It is meant to celebrate and affirm the monarch's power. It is indeed a symbol for a new kind of rule that develops during the Baroque age, absolute monarchy, which is in fact pretty much the creation of Louis XIV. The story of the palace starts in 1624, when Louis's predecessor, conveniently named Louis XIII, builds a hunting lodge in what is now a suburb of Paris. The original hunting pavilion still exists. In fact, it became the center of Louis XIV's palace. Located at the end of the Cour Royale, it was built in bricks and stone and comprises a main rectangular building flanked on the sides by 2 wings that meet on a low portico, delimiting a courtyard called the Marble Court. In 1668, Louis XIV decided to enlarge the pavilion so he could move the court away from Paris. What became the embodiment of French Baroque art and architecture was in fact motivated by a political agenda, as Louis wanted to keep an eye on the nobility. Every French noble had to spend every year some time at Versailles. This decision was most likely motivated by the series of revolts that took place between 1648 and 53 during the minority of Louis XIV. La Fronde was a reaction to the policies begun under the chief minister of Louis XIII, the Cardinal de Richelieu, which weakened the influence of the nobility and reduced the powers of the judicial bodies called parlements, and which continued under the next chief minister, the Cardinal Mazarin. We have to wait until the French Revolution, almost a century and a half later, to see such a challenge to the supremacy of the French monarchy. This time, though, the revolt was crushed. The Frondeurs' failure to limit the growing power of the royal government and the measures that the young king took to curtail the nobility's power paved the way for the absolutism of Louis XIV's reign. One might say that this is when the last bit of the feudal structure collapsed, with the power remaining in the sole hands of the king, indeed ushering absolute monarchy. Here you can see how the hunting lodge, which is the part that is red in that ground plan, became the center of the current palace, enveloped by new buildings. And indeed, the early architects talked about l'enveloppe, the envelope. What happened is the transformations were directed first by Louis Le Vau, who worked at the palace until his death in 1670. And interestingly, when Louis first hired Le Vau, Le Vau's original plan was to just raise everything and build a new palace. And Louis said, no, we keep the lodge. And so hence came the idea of the envelope, this way of enveloping that original hunting pavilion. So he extended the Cour de Marbre with two elegant wings finished by porticos with a terraced roof. At that time, the interior was completely transformed under the supervision of Charles Lebrun. More on this later. Then, as I said, Le Vau worked until he died in 1670, and so then Jules Hardouin-Mansart took over, connecting the projecting wings to Le Vau's central building and harmonized the elements. So, even this is the garden side now. So when you come to Versailles, you do see the original lodge. When you look at Versailles from the other side, you get this fully harmonious facade. Because indeed, even if different architects were involved, harmony, logic, and reason command the whole project. Indeed, in its architecture, interior decoration, furniture, works of art, and gardens, the garden is the prototype of French classicism. The building has a slightly rusticated ground floor. What we call rustication is when it looks more like rough stone, right? When you see the different bits of stone. This is not a very heavy kind of rustication, but you can see the individual stones on the ground floor. Then the main floor, what in Italian is referred to as il piano nobile, the noble floor, which is the tallest and most ornate part of the building's elevation, has Ionic columns and pilasters and arched windows. And then we have an attic story with almost square windows, which is topped by a balustrade with trophies and urns. It was during Louis XIV's reign that the Royal Academies of Art and Sculpture and of Architecture were founded. In case you wonder, the French Academy had been founded earlier in 1635. Fundamental to their principles were the lessons from the Roman architect Vitruvius, themselves the basis for the works of high Italian Renaissance architects such as Vignola and Palladio. And I thought I would show you an edition of Vitruvius in French that was just published around that time. By the way, those of you all know this famous image by Leonardo da Vinci of the man. We refer to it as the Vitruvian man because Leonardo copied this idea. It's really a system of human proportions from the works of Vitruvius, the Roman architect. So you had heard of Vitruvius, even if you didn't know about him. So here we find Renaissance architectural elements assembled, as I said, with logic and reason, creating a harmonious balance between horizontal and vertical elements with projecting sections that prevent monotony. And yet, this is not a purely classical building, for it also embodies Baroque values. It is classical because of its orderly harmony and of the regular repetition of clearly defined and symmetrically placed elements. But the building's enormous scale introduces an irrational dimension, and this is not classical. To give you an idea, there are 123 windows on each floor. The palace is indeed so huge that no photo can give a complete view of it. Well, one does. It's an aerial view. This is the only way you can grasp the entire complex. But this is really somewhat ironical, or at least puzzling, since no such views were available then. The first hot air balloon was built by the Montgolfier brothers only a century later, in 1783. Although the vocabulary used at Versailles in Versailles architecture is classical, by its gigantic scale that overwhelms the viewer and thus proclaims the king's power, the palace is Baroque. I know you're wondering, what the hell is Baroque? When I told a friend I was going to be lecturing on Versailles, on Baroque art at Versailles, he immediately thought of this line, which Disney movie is it, Harry? If it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. If it isn't Baroque, don't fix it.
I don't remember.
Anyway, it's a Disney movie. I did not know it. I thought it was super cute. So, in case you're wondering, what does that mean, something Baroque? So, in a nutshell, I won't do another lecture on Baroque art, but we could. It's the style that first develops at the end of the 16th century. And that style, and this is very important, and you'll see why it's important for Versailles, it became a fundamental tool for the Roman Catholic Church in its fighting the progress of the Protestant Reformation. Take the ceiling from the mother church of the Jesuit order, the very order created at the Council of Trent with the specific goal of halting the progress of the Reformation. This ceiling is meant to awe you, displaying at once an image of heaven while also affirming the power of the Roman Catholic Church. But, as the great art historian Ernst Gombrich declared, it was not only the Roman Church that had discovered the power of art to impress and overwhelm. The kings and princes of 17th century Europe were equally anxious to display their might and thus to increase their hold on the minds of people. They too wanted to appear as beings of another kind, lifted by divine right above the common run of men. This applies particularly to the most powerful rule of the latter part of the 17th century, Louis XIV of France, in whose political program the display and splendor of royalty was deliberately used. Note that both Versailles and the Baroque ceiling are multimedia works of art that deploy many different materials and modes of expression: architecture, sculpture, painting, and in the case of Versailles, gardens. At Versailles, it is not only the building that is gargantuan. Note, this is just, I'm opening a parenthesis, note that that scale was really a practical requirement, since it needed to allow for every noble to spend some time at the palace. Depending on the day, there were between 3,000 and 10,000 people there. So it needed to be big. But there's additional reasons. And the surrounding grounds as well are on an equally gigantic scale. Just as Versailles became the model for many other European palaces, the gardens, the masterpiece of André Le Nôtre, became the prototype of the so-called French gardens, Jardin à la Française. They were created between 1661 and 68 with considerable engineering work. I should add that the original hunting lodge, and this is mind-boggling when you think about it, the original hunting lodge was on top of a hill. So the ground was not flat. And you can see how extensive it is. I'll show you an even larger ground plan. All that had to be perfectly flat so you could have those bodies of water, especially the huge Grand Canal that you'll see later. So imagine the engineering work that took place to just flatten everything out. Furthermore, it was a really not very good area. It was marshy. It was all marsh. It was marshy, and yet there was not good running water. So we'll talk more about the engineering that was required to get all those fountains going. More on this later. In the gardens, too, the general organization is classical and architectural in spirit, with flower beds neatly edged. Charles Lebrun was in charge of the decoration of the gardens, and he collected a great number of antique statues, along with works by contemporary artists. Louis was an Italophile of the first rank, and for Versailles, he ordered copies of famous ancient sculptures. You might have recognized, you can show the next one, the famous Apollo Belvedere. So here you have two different views of the copy at Versailles, and then you have it, the original one, so to speak, because the sculpture known as the Apollo Belvedere is a Roman copy of a Greek sculpture. But it's the Roman one that became famous, hence the nickname of Apollo Belvedere. More on Apollo later. Bear with me. Here you can see how the garden itself is regularly divided into sections. By the way, there you can see the Grand Canal I was mentioning. So to have such a large body of water, it's over a mile long, so you really need flat ground. So you can think about the engineering that went on. So yes, the gardens are really divided into those sections, very neat. They're called bosquets or groves. That's how they're usually referred to in English. They're outdoor rooms, if you will, each with a very specific mood and offering a different spectacle. In fact, the entire complex of Versailles was meant to function as a theatrical setting, the setting for the performance of a meaningful ritual, which, just as the palace and the gardens, is at the service of a monumental metaphor, celebrating the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV, the Sun King. And indeed, the whole conception of the palace is woven around this metaphorical name. First, its layout. The central axis runs east-west, following the path of the sun as it travels from Paris and passes through the palace to set over the hills in the distance beyond the mile-long Grand Canal. Moreover, at the exact center of the palace, next slide, is the king's bedroom. Thank you, Ari. Is the king's bedroom. The ritual created around the life of the king is itself a metaphorization of his identification with the sun. Courtiers assisted to his lever and his coucher. In French, as you can see, the same words are used for waking up and for going to bed as for the rising and the setting of the sun. The famous Hall of Mirrors is the perfect illustration of the importance of light as a metaphor for the Sun King. About 240 feet long, it is powerfully rectilinear, rhythmed by arches and pilasters. On one side, we have 17 large windows to which correspond 17 Venetian mirror panels. Keep in mind that mirrors were extremely expensive and that these were the largest at the time. We have a total of 400 mirror pieces. And Venetian mirrors were the best at the time. And the idea was really to get the mirrors that would deform the less, hence the Venetian ones, which were, of course, the most expensive. The mirrored panels, which are placed precisely facing the windows, reflect and intensify the rays of the sun. Mirrors and windows dissolve the architecture and create an unlimited illusory space. It is almost disorienting and thus challenges the rationality of the classical architectural vocabulary. You might notice the amount of gilding that is used. It is not just a luxurious material, but one that further enhances the light. Now, the Hall of Mirror extends between two salons, the Salon of War and the Salon of Peace. In the Salon of War, in a relief by Antoine Coisvox, we see a triumphal image of Louis trampling enemies. The barrel vault of the Hall of Mirrors bears paintings by Charles Lebrun, which, just like the entire palace, glorify the king's rule. In this section, for instance, we see the perfect illustration of the notion of absolute monarchy as it declares, "Le roi gouverne par lui-même," the king governs by himself. The paintings on the barrel vault take their full meaning as the gallery connects the two salons of war and of peace and promote the old and unfortunately still current idea of waging war to keep peace. The choices that were made are revealing. This scene, for instance, shows Louis in a very positive light, even though the French were later defeated by the Dutch during this particular episode of the Franco-Dutch War. Quick aparté here, very poignantly so, when Louis was on his deathbed and his grandson, the future Louis XVI, came to see him, he said to him, "I have loved war too much." So that was kind of his parting advice to his successor. Charles Lebrun, the author of these paintings, and indeed of the entire decorative program of Versailles of Louis XIV, was the most important figure in French art, in the French art world at the time. Lebrun played a major role in the foundation in 1648 of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. He was elected one of the original 12 elders in charge of its running and successively occupied positions of chancellor, rector, and finally director. Until his death in 1690, he defined art in France. Although the Academy became the source for the expression academic art, used today and starting in the 19th century to refer to conservative art, this was not always the case. It was not the case at the time. The first academy, the model for others to follow, such as the French one, was founded at the end of the 16th century in Bologna. I have a Bolognese friend there on the first row, and promoted cutting-edge ideals grounded in the study of ancient and high Renaissance art. Here you can see a page from a book by Lebrun that contains a lecture he gave in 1668 at the Académie Royale de Peinture et Sculpture. The book is illustrated with prints based on Lebrun's drawings. You can imagine how such a book would be useful to artists. It shows you, for instance, with these illustrations here, how to render a whole range of facial expressions that betray emotions such as fear, laughter, anger, fright, sadness, acute pain, or despair. I mentioned that Louis was an Italophile. He and his first ministers tried for years to convince Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the best Baroque sculptor of the time and one of the best sculptors of all times, to come to France. When finally Bernini accepted, he met Louis in April 1664, and the king pronounced the famous phrase. This was kind of his brief to the sculptor: "Speak to me of nothing small," a phrase that fits Versailles to a T. Bernini received the commission for this portrait in June. The king sat for 13 one-hour-long session, while Bernini worked directly in marble. The sculptor, he found a felicitous solution. Normally busts are a bit stupid if you think about it, because you kind of chop the bust, right? Your arms stop, your chest stops. We're used to seeing busts. When we think about it, it's a little bizarre. But Bernini came up with this amazing idea of having this flowing drapery that hides what happens there. And it adds also to the sculpture incredible dynamism. And we talked a little bit about the composition of the portrait by Rigaud. Look what Bernini is doing here with the kind of the flowing drapery taking you in one direction, the glance of Louis going in the other. And so you create all these diagonals that take over the space around the sculpture and literally activate it. So that amount of dynamism, that, by the way, is very Baroque as well. And so, not surprisingly, this bust by Bernini became a model for depictions of absolutist monarchs. I mean, it really says something about the quality of his rule, right? Someone who's both very self-assured, who takes over the space, who radiates formally, and therefore it translates this idea of the Sun King. You can see why that would prove to be so successful. Bernini's bust resides in the salon named after the ancient goddess Diana, a figure who reappears, you can go to the many times throughout the palace, and here you see in the gardens, as in this sculpture by Martin Desjardins, and there you see the sculpture, the print made from the sculpture, where she's both Diana and the personification of the evening, because indeed, as you probably know it, Diana was the goddess of the moon. And as such, she is the counterpart to her brother Apollo, the god of the sun. Apollo being indeed one of the most important figures in Versailles' absolutist rhetoric. André Philibien, Louis XIV's official court historian, wrote in 1674, so he's writing as the palace is being built. I'm quoting him, "Since the sun was the emblem of Louis XIV, and poets fused the sun and Apollo, everything at Versailles was related to that god." But even before Versailles was transformed into the royal palace of the Sun King, when the young Louis was 15 years old, he performed in the Ballet Royal de la Nuit, the royal ballet of the night, and played the role of Apollo. This ballet de cour illustrated the victory of royal power and the personal triumph of Louis. The action took place in many different settings, from the royal court to slums in Paris. But it took place over a single night, from dusk to dawn. At the end, Aurora arrived in her chariot, heralding the apotheosis of Apollo, the sun god. There were 250 different allegorical costumes meant to reveal the figure's character. And so you can see Apollo / Louis / the sun, how he was dressed in sparkling silk with gold decoration, with this amazing motif of the rays around his head. Not surprisingly then, at Versailles, the throne room is named Salon d'Apollon. On its ceiling, we see Apollo accompanied by the allegorical figures of France, magnanimity, and magnificence, along with the seasons, having the same problem again, the seasons, there we go, represented by the ancient gods, Flora, Ceres, Bacchus, and Saturn. So Flora for spring, Ceres for summer, Bacchus for fall, grape harvest, anybody, and Saturn for winter. As Philibien wrote, everything at Versailles was related to Apollo, and it would take me days to inventory all the ways in which the ancient god is present at the palace. So let me take a couple of examples drawn from the gardens. South of the Grand Canal is the basin of Apollo, with sculptures by Jean-Baptiste Tuby, showing Apollo emerging from the water in his chariot. In the sculptural group, Apollo is tended by the nymphs and evokes the aftermath of his descent into the sea, at the end of his daily procession across the heavens. It was originally located close to the king's bedroom, equating the god's rest after his day with that of the monarch. The engravings on the right show the original setting in the so-called Grotto of Tethys, an under-the-sea setting decorated with precious stones, shells, mirrors, and mosaics. It was one of the most celebrated features of early Versailles, but it was demolished in 1684 to make way for the north wing of the expanding palace. Its sculptures were preserved and transferred to the gardens, and eventually, in the 18th century, the sculptures were given a new setting by a very famous artist, Hubert Robert. This fountain has to do with Apollo and with Louis, but in a rather oblique manner, as it deals with the story of Latona, mistress of Jupiter and mother of Apollo and Diana. The story goes that Latona had asked Jupiter to take revenge on the Lycian farmers who had refused to give her water. Revenge? The farmers were changed into frogs. Versailles' Fountain of Latona might have several meanings, all of them cryptic. The fountain might allude to Madame de Montespan, mistress of Louis XIV and mother of several illegitimate children. But a more political meaning has also been suggested, bringing us back to where we started, to the events of La Fronde, which took place during the regency of Louis XIV's mother, Anne of Austria. Although the Fronde had occurred during living memory of the people spending time at Versailles, such events were never openly mentioned. I think there was a real trauma, and in particular trauma for Louis himself, who was just 10 years old when his whole family and parents were really menaced. So you couldn't really openly talk about the Fronde, and yet this is probably about the Fronde. And it would work because presenting ideas in a disguised form was not a problem for the people at the court. For at the time, there was a literary and social movement called préciosité, preciosity. Some of you might know the Molière play called Les Précieuses Ridicules, the ridiculous precious. He pokes fun at some women who were part of that movement. So that movement, that the préciosité, was characterized by its witty playfulness, with which it explored concepts as riddles and through metaphors. To give you an example of such riddles that the précieux would use, the figure of Pandora would refer to the idea of secret, because after all, there's an analogy between the telling of a secret and the opening of Pandora's box. So for the précieux, to just mention Pandora would be a way of equating it with the concept of a secret, or a way of giving kind of an image to the concept, the abstract concept of what is a secret. The Fountain of Latona, if you will, is not unlike what the précieux would call an enigma, in which Latona would allude to Anne of Austria and the Lycian farmers punished by Jupiter, the Frondeur. So imagine, right? Latona, mother of Apollo, Anne of Austria, mother of Louis. It's all a series of equivalences. It gets better. Because one of the Parisian neighborhoods where the nobility lived was Le Marais, the marsh. As you can see, such fountains are highly theatrical, and I should note that in many of them, water itself performs. So yeah, I've told you how to get running water there was truly amazing, because it was marshy, but there was no running water in Versailles. So they had to come up with incredible, complex engineering systems to bring water. There was one that they created called La Machine de Marly, which brought water from the river Seine, which is not next door. At one point, they even thought of building an aqueduct to bring water, but it was so expensive that never was done. During Louis, of course, now you can go and the waters are running, no problem. We have modern technology, but there was not enough water at the time to make every fountain run at the same time. Good thing that they're far apart. So what they would do, as the king would take his walk, they would announce that he's arriving, and they would quickly open up, and so the water could be, rushing just in time for the king to admire it. This is what, by the way, in French we call les grandes eaux de Versailles, which has become a word we use in everyday speech when someone cries. as in, oh no, don't start with the great waters of Versailles. See how it stayed in our speech. So yes, the water really performed at Versailles, as is perfectly illustrated by this bosquet I showed you early, called Le Théâtre d'Eau, the water theatre. In fact, the whole garden was meant as the setting for performances. And same thing with the palace, right? Life at Versailles was a performance. As early as May 1664, just a few years after Le Nôtre had started his work in the garden, so we're like 3 years after the beginning of the work, when there was enough of the gardens that were finished, a spectacular celebration took place in the gardens. It was called La Fête des Plaisirs de Liloncente, or Feast of the Pleasures of the Enchanted Isle. It took place over 3 days. To give you an idea of the whole encompassing spectacle, at the end of the first day, there was a ballet of the signs of the Zodiac, with personifications of the different signs, holding torches and dancing. Then came the seasons. So, right, you get the Zodiac, you get the seasons, so it's the whole time is represented, is kind of performed in this celebration. So then came the seasons, each mounted on a different exotic animal. You had to bring the exotic animals. Spring was on horseback. That's fine. Then, it gets better, summer on an elephant, autumn on a camel, and winter on a bear. Then appeared gardeners, harvesters, grape gatherers, and old men with icicles. These figures, symbolizing the 4 seasons, brought baskets and dishes for the buffet. At this point, Pan and Diana arrived on what was described as, and I'm quoting a witness, the most ingenious machine in the shape of a little hill shaded by several trees, so a whole hill moving. A supper followed by attendants holding up such a vast quantity of tallow, torches, and candles that, again, witness said it was as clear as daylight. The third day was spent around a vast pond with 3 islands. Mythological figures sailed on sea monsters. There were ballets featuring giants, dwarfs, knights, and more monsters. That day as well ended up in a blaze of light. The palace in the largest island went up a glory of flares and rockets. Louis died in 1715, 4 days before his 77th birthday. He had been king for 72 years and 110 days, the longest reign in the history of France, but also of Europe. In fact, Queen Elizabeth II of England hasn't beat him yet. It's getting there, but the aristocracy, held in captivity in Versailles, could go back to the city and build city mansions called hôtels particuliers. Here you see a salon from the Hotel De Vangeville, originally on the Boulevard Saint-Germain in Paris, but now much closer to us. It's in the Met in New York. Closer, right? Mm-hmm. At that time, we see a shift in architecture towards the interior. Obviously, the cramped city setting didn't allow for much focus on the outside architecture, but most importantly, and this is not just a practical reason, culturally as well, we see a shift to private living. And the fact is, because of Louis having died, and he had insisted on having the nobility in Versailles, and it was incredibly claustrophobic to be stuck in Versailles. Apparently, any conversation at Versailles started with on dit. One says, I have heard. It was all about gossip. I recommend, by the way, to see a movie called Ridicule. Has anybody ever seen it? It's about the court at Versailles just before the revolution. So that kind of ambiance was still continuing. But with Louis having died, that requirement of being at Versailles really got lessened, relieved a bit. And so, indeed, the nobility is moving back to places like Paris. And instead of having a culture that is all about being seen in Versailles, right, with the king performing this ritual of kingship. People can have private lives again. And you see that reflected in the architecture and the interior decoration. So yes, you can't do much as an architect about the facade of an hôtel particulier because the entrance is often rather small. It's a street city, but you can do a lot inside. And so you see architects focusing on the inside and creating complete environments which combine paneling and gilded moldings, furniture, objects, paintings, and mirrors. There is, of course, some continuity. As I always tell my students, things continue a little bit. It's not like all of a sudden it's time for the Renaissance or, done with the Middle Ages. Let's switch. Things continue. There's things that remain. And there is continuity with the previous century. Both have gilding, painted decoration, and mirrors. But Versailles was meant to dwarf you, to make you feel the powerful radiance of the Sun King, while these new interiors aim to please you. They are lighter and more intimate. The boudoir, a very intimate room, becomes the emblematic space of this new style. In this painting by Francois Boucher, we see the Marquise de Pompadour, King Louis XV, mistress lounging in her boudoir. Notice her very showy dress, but notice as well her very relaxed position. So even though she's wearing her finery, she's very comfortable, right? She's not performing, she's not standing straight like Louis did in his grand portrait. She is at ease in her private environment. This new style is characterized by a delicate decoration with gilded elements that are applied to white walls, although the colors that become popular at the time are pastels, so very pale, very feminine, very light colors. And those shapes adopt a whole array of flowy and organic forms. We have arabesque, we have sea scallops, we have sea as in not sea from, but sea like the letter. Right? But shells are there, believe me. Fantastic birds, bats' wings, acanthus leaves. Furniture is similarly enhanced with gilt bronze, as you can see in the little detail of that little table by the Pompadour. We call this new style Rococo, derived from rocaille, which rocaille is the word we use in French for a rock garden, un jardin de rocaille, as its shell-like forms are reminiscent of grotto decorations with shells and pebbles. Rocaille. Things change at Versailles as well, as you can see in this building, small one, named the Petit Trianon to distinguish it from the existing marble Trianon, or Grand Trianon today. It was gifted by the young King Louis XVI to his wife. Who's the wife? Who's the wife of Louis XVI? Thank you. Look how dainty and welcoming it seems in comparison to the palace. But notice that the vocabulary remains the same, right? The building blocks are the same, but the scale, of course, it's a private space, but that also encapsulates what the Rococo is about. This is the interior with the Salon de la Paix for comparison. It's a place for pleasure. And one thing you might want to notice, so different from the way we live today, notice the light furniture that you can move around and gather as needed for conversation, for music, or for playing cards. Back to Paris. Jean-Antoine Watteau created this large painting for his friend, the art dealer Edmé François Gersain, for his shop on one of the bridges on the Seine River, the Pont Notre-Dame. Until later in the 18th century, the Pont Notre-Dame had houses, just like the Ponte Vecchio in Florence, still today, with shops on the ground floor, all, as you might notice, with an arched opening. Originally, Watteau's painting had an arch corresponding to the opening of the shops on the bridge. So here you can see the shape of the original panel. Actually, it's 2 canvases put together, and you can see 2 digital simulations of possible placements for the signboard. The painting was purchased a mere 2 weeks after it was put in place. Someone just wanted to buy it. Gersaint, being an art dealer, said, of course you can buy it. But the person who purchased it wanted it square, so someone enlarged it to make it rectangular, the way it is today. Gersaint sold art, as I said, but also luxury objects. Now, what Watteau does with this painting is interesting because he sets a contrast between the shop's interior with all the art that covers the walls and the very aristocratic customers, and the outside with the street, right, with the cobblestones on the floor, on the ground, a dog on one side, and on the other a bale of hay. We see a crate on that area that is pretty much in between that inside and that outside, an area that corresponds to the spot where the painting was meant to be displayed. The crate has, we see people lowering into that crate a painting. Now, look at the portrait. Next slide. That's being crated. Does it remind you of anybody? You're supposed to answer.
The portrait of Louis XIV.
Yes. Next one. Bingo. It's Louis. First of all, yes, it's an allusion to the shop's name, Au Grand Monarque, at the Great Monarchs. But there might be more than just a reference to the store's name. Yes, you can go to the next one. I am reminded of this wonderful photo by Lisa Keressi, in which a disco ball is being similarly packed away. The series this photo belongs to is called The Party's Over. Watteau painted the signboard only 6 years after Louis XIV had died. Indeed, his reign is being put away. Although for the nobility, and those of you who've seen the actually dreadful, but maybe you liked it, Sofia Coppola movie on Marie Antoinette, they were partying, we know that. So the nobility will continue to party, well, at least until the revolution. But for us, with this image, it really signals the end of that era, what we call, hence the title of my lecture, Le Grand Siècle. Thank you. Did Marcia tell you I grew up in Switzerland? I'm very pleased. 1 hour and 55 minutes. Just what I wanted. So we have tons of time for questions, if you're not shy, and you shouldn't. Someone has to start. It's the first question that's the toughest. Yes, thank you. You're everybody's hero.
What we learned yesterday is the dance, you have to have that pose. I wonder if that came from Louis.
You know, I took once a class in historic dance, and we learned the gavotte. So, yeah. It's very, you would hold your body in different, yeah.
Did that come from Louis XIV, or did he get it from
It's the style of dance of the period. Because remember, he learned to dance from an early age, so it was the way dance was taught. Yeah. And you notice that it's I said in fourth, but it's not like a perfect fourth, right? It's more like that. So it's a little bit more relaxed. But yeah, if in case you wonder, we learned to dance the gavotte to the Inde galante, to Rameau. So I will always recognize a gavotte because it goes 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta-dam, dum, ta-dam, dum, dum. And then you make figures. So this is where it becomes interesting. So we could dance too. For Mr. Shannon, we can go forward and back, and we'd be dum, dum, ta-dam, dum, and then up to the same place. And so what we do, that's all it takes to gavotte, to dance the gavotte. But the big thing about dancing the gavotte, and you'll see where I'm getting at, is you make figures. And the figures have names. And for instance, there's one that was called the jet d'eau, just like a water spout. So you get those very regular patterns that the dancers are making, occupying space, just like the gardens. So you see how everything is about control and very patterned. Yeah, it was about dance. Yes.
Some of the fountains were projecting that water. It looks like about 30, almost 40 feet in the air. And were these recent with electricity, or how did they get the water that high?
I'm not an engineering. They definitely did go very high. The problem was they couldn't do that in all of them. There was not enough pressure. But that's why they would operate one fountain at a time. But there were.
There must have been an aqueduct at least 75 feet.
So they never built, but they built something, as I said, the name was La Machine de Marly because of the town of Marly that brought water because there was no proper water in sight, and certainly not water with enough pressure. But don't ask me too much. I am pathetic with anything technical, so I can't describe those machines but this is also a time when l'Académie des Sciences is created, right? So there are very good scientists and scientific minds at the court at the time. And we shouldn't poo-poo the technical abilities of past times. I could, for instance, tell you, I'm digressing, but you'll see where I'm getting at, medieval cranes were phenomenal. So, without electricity, there were ways of operating things with great efficiency. So, but don't ask me too much about the actual machinery. Yes?
It would be interesting to have more knowledge of that. In India, the Emperor Akbar abandoned his capital because of the shortage of water.
I couldn't hear.
Akbar abandoned his capital for lack of water.
Well, there was water nearby. They had to bring it. And as I said, there was apparently never enough to really operate and make water moving in all the fountains at once, the way you can do it today. But there was nevertheless water. And we're not in a very, very hot place, right? It's a more, even though they're having a dreadful drought and water and heat wave in Europe right now, and people are literally dying. It's temperate climate with the Seine not far and definitely enough water. So I wouldn't compare it with India. But yes, what they wanted to do with the water was so much over the top that it had limitations. You have a question, I knew it. And yeah.
The gardens are, as they are today, not just sculpture, but vegetation. How close do they resemble what was there then? Because they're quite expensive.
Yes.
I think it takes a lot of water to support them.
Oh, one thing, absolutely. And one thing I didn't tell you, two things I didn't tell you, is Louis was incredibly impatient. He wanted that done right now. The construction was seriously problematic because he wanted so much to be done so fast that, of course, there were lots of accidents. And apparently the bodies of the casualties were taken out under the cover of night because, you can see how that down the line, just wait another century and you get the French Revolution. So I don't mean to sound like, especially when I talk about the feudal pyramid, like, the Ancien Régime was so nice. Yay for nobility at the top. But you can see the grounds, though, he couldn't wait for trees to grow. So they brought fully grown trees, and that too required, and don't ask me technical questions about that, but I can tell you that they even came up with specific contraptions so they could bring and plant fully mature trees. By the way, the park, when was that? For Shelia, you might remember when, 10, 15 years ago, you might remember, there was this terrible storm in Paris and some of the windows of the Sainte-Chapelle were damaged. Remember when that happened? really bad weather, big storm, and several of the trees, a lot of trees in the park of Versailles were damaged, which was, a major disaster. But yeah, they planted fully grown trees.
It just crosses my mind that if you had maybe 100 people blowing in a tube into a water contained in an enclosed area, you could probably get.
It was a machine. It was not human. Yeah.
Well, is there any evidence that there were 50 people or 100 people doing it?
It wasn't powered like that. No. Because there's contraptions where you can you turn things and boom, the water comes. So the mechanism is there, embedded in each of the fountains. See what I mean? And there's, again, don't ask me too much, but it's all a question of pressure, isn't it? And well, you have that when you open your faucet in my garden, right? You know what I mean. So no, you don't need people blowing. Angela.
So you mentioned in the Fete de Pleiser that there were all like the fake hill that moved.
Of course, you love that. Yeah.
Animals. So were any of the animals real?
Oh yeah. Well, I'm not sure when. Maybe someone knows. When was the Jardin des Plantes created?
Oh no, later. That was later.
Okay, but Buffon was a 17th century dude.
The animals started. That was like the first zoo there at Versailles. But I'm just saying. So some of the animals were real, like the elephant.
Oh yeah.
Okay, because you made a fake hill, so I thought maybe they made fake.
It's
animals.
It's easier to bring an elephant when you're the king, right? And you collect.
Right.
No, let's be serious. Collecting exotic animals. I know you're shaking your head. The Duke of Berry, late 14th, easy to remember. He died in 1416. 1416, yeah, I think 18, 16, and 14 teens. The Duke of Berry, who lived at the end of the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, had a whole collection of exotic animals. He had bears, because in fact that was one of his emblems. You see bears on the borders of his manuscript. Swans, not a big deal, but exotic animals. In fact, the first time I went to Hearst Castle, and they take you up the hill to the castle. I think this is like the Duke of Berry, because they describe all the exotic animals that Hearst had in his garden. So that was done for quite a long time, to as a sign of your might, right? To have a collection of exotic animals.
I know this isn't your field, but who were Louis XIV's favorite composers?
Oh, well, no, that's easy. Lully was at the court. In fact, I didn't mention it. I think it was for the Plaisir de Liloncente, or was it for one of them? We don't know for sure, but Lully might have worked at it. No, it was definitely Lully and Rameau, but these are the ones we know today from that period, who in our mind are really, the 17th century French composers. Of course, they became famous because you couldn't become famous in the late 17th century in France if you weren't at the court. So the very fact.
He liked the Italian. He liked Italian also.
That's right. That's right. That was the idea was, it's all done also with that political idea that because Italian art had such a prestige, the idea of developing arts in France in such a way that it would compete and be more important than Italian art, it's a game of one-upmanship. So if Italian art is the reference, of course that's what you want to be beating. Yes?
Two questions. The style of mirrors, okay, wondering if you have any time how long it took to build that, and how much of that material was imported? Did they get all
Well, the mirrors come from Venice. The mirrors come from Venice.
Yeah, okay, fine.
Because they had to be Venetian mirrors because a French mirror was not good enough.
Right.
So, yeah. And speaking of importing stuff, later on, I didn't have time to show you some more examples of Rococo objects, but you see that already in the 17th century. Chinese porcelain mounted with metal, gilded, kind of as a way of I think there's two things going on. It's almost like presenting it, right? Adorning it and putting it on a pedestal, like framing a picture. But it's also a way of appropriating it, right? By adding something Western around it and kind of making it fit the general style. But that was done, definitely, porcelains from far away were brought. As to how long the Galerie des Glaces took, I don't know. I'm sure if you look it up, you can find the exact. But you can see how quickly things were built. It was quite remarkable. Your second question?
This is not a question. I wonder if there's any evidence of the Rococo style ceiling in Versailles.
There's a continuity, because if you look very carefully, some of the decorative elements have that flowy quality, but what you retain in Versailles is things are very divided. The different elements in the architecture are very much, marked. And so the elements are still there, and you have, rectilinear paneling in Rococo. But when you move to the Rococo, more and more what you're going to find is an organic quality in the architecture. So when at Versailles, and you have it here, because this is very much built according to classical concept, you see, you don't need those moldings there, but you can see what they're doing. They're clearly telling you where the wall stops and where the vault starts. Right? So it really separates what is vault, what is wall. And so you get a line with molding. In Rococo architecture, that kind of distinction is going to be abolished. As much as possible, the architects will try to keep something flowing, moving from, and much more organic shape, so you get like round rooms or even rooms. You start getting that in Baroque art, don't get me wrong. To get ground plans of churches that are not just, boxy things, but have a more flowy and organic feel. That's why it's tough. When we teach that stuff, we like to divide things in a clear way so students kind of, can tell what Rococo is from. So we might oversimplify things because there is continuity. But yes, what you would get with Rococo is underplay the linear elements, overplay everything that is organic, and you start getting things that are not even symmetrical. Look at a Rococo sconce. You will have like flame-like things. A Baroque candle holder would be perfectly symmetrical. Well, a Rococo one would go in one direction but not the other. See what I mean? Does that help? Yes?
I don't know if there's any significance in terms of like the number of windows or the number of mirrors or the number of openings. You gave us information like there were this
17.
windows. I was just curious if there was any conceptual relationships between deciding about numbers and...
I think that's a great question. I was wondering, because when I was writing, and I wrote down 17 is a strange number.
Yeah.
What I would want to do is look exactly with the garden facade, because when you look at the garden facade, it's such an endless facade, right? But as I said, there's those elements that come forward. There's very interesting patterns of rhythm, right? With some of those things that come forward, those bodies of architect with columns. Some are wider than others, so even there you have some rhythmic patterns. So what I would want to look at is what's happening on the facade, how many and remember they were connecting things. By the way, it's the presence of the Galerie des Glaces that allows to have that unified facade, because it corresponds to the other side of the original pavilion, which on the entrance side, on the Cour Royale side, really shows its original colors, right? I mean, the brick and stone, while when you look at the garden facade, it's all exactly the same. So yeah, you would have to look exactly where it is, you know, corresponding to those things that come forward, and I wouldn't be able to answer like that. Yes?
Louis XIV is clearly a hard act to follow.
Very hard act to follow.
Hadn't Louis XV.
But you know, he had a difficult end of his life, Louis XIV, and you saw this very strange thing to say to the young future Louis XVI, that he had loved war too much. So he kind, you know, what seemed like, you know, I go to war, I have a gazillion mistresses, and you know, I'm in great shape. Of course, he became old and invalid then. Oh, and then towards the end of his life, he kind of, his last mistress, Madame de Montespan, whom he actually married secretly, it was what we call in French a mariage morganatique, was extremely religious. So that you know, so things changed. I mean, he became kind of a little somber towards the end of his life. So this is, you know, very kind of triumphal and beautiful and high, uplifting, and then came Louis XVI, a whole other story, and the country became bankrupt. That too. I mean, it became bankrupt. Add to that, really bad. I mean, people really starving. Can't even go there. But one thing I'm fascinated by is that, especially for us today, as we think about global warming and pattern, you know, weather changes, there was, starting in the 17th century, a thing that is referred to by historians of the weather, at least in French, we call it the Little Ice Age. Only stupid me would go to Holland at Christmas time and bring my skates, because I assumed, just like in the paintings, all the canals would be frozen, and that happens very seldom. It hasn't happened in a long time. But the Little Ice Age, that was definitely taking place already during the 17th century, when the Dutch were painting all those people skating in the canals, continuing in the 18th. Some people have said had a role to play in the French Revolution, just because of all the bad harvests and people really starving. So add to that, and the government being bankrupt, on and on and on. It's a complicated story, you know. And yesterday was the 14th of July. And there too, I mean, when I say it's a complicated story, the only anthem I know is the Marseillaise, because I was educated in French schools. But when you think about the words of the Marseillaise, you know, a friend sent me a message because I posted something, you know, wishing my friends Joyeux 14 Juillet. Someone said, Allons enfants de la patrie. No, I think she added the second, line, Le jour de gloire est arrivé. And I almost quoted the next one, Contre nous de la tyrannie. L'étendard, against us, the tyranny, the bloody standard is elevated. And it's chilly, right? I mean, it's filled with blood. And yet this is, the French anthem. And we still think so highly of the revolution, and yet not exactly. So history is complicated. How about that for a parting word?